But first, we're going to hear from two very distinguished observers and participants in the fiscal policy debates over the past 25 years, Mark Weinberger and Jason Furman. And as a Concord Coalition board member, Mark Weinberger gets to go first. Mark is the global chairman and CEO of EY, a leading global professional services organization. He was Assistant Secretary of Treasury for tax policy before that, and has also served on the Social Security Advisory Board. Particularly relevant to the Concord Coalition is that Mark was the Chief of Staff to the Kerry Danforth Entitlement and Tax Reform Commission in 1994-95. Worked for Jack Danforth back then. Jack Danforth and Bob Kerry now happen to be the co-chairs of the Concord Coalition. Mark is on the executive committee of the Business Roundtable, and he chairs their Tax and Fiscal Policy Committee. And so that's quite a background to lead us forward into taking a look at the fiscal challenges and solutions of the next 25 years. So Mark, okay. It's all yours.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, Bob. It's an honor to be here. I am pleased that being on the board gets me some privileges. I get to go first. I am a stand-in for Doug Holtz-Eakin, who would have been tremendous today. But I'm honored to be here to help celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Concord Coalition, and particularly honored to be part of an organization that Bob Kerry and Jack Danforth, two of my former bosses, are on the board of, along with Congressman Tanner and Kessel. It is odd to be standing here, and I've known and learned about the coalition since as a young staffer. It's kind of like when I became chairman and CEO of EY, the newspaper, the Scranton. I'm growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania. They called my mom, and they said, Mark, your son was just announced the chairman and CEO of Ernst & Young. And she said, and I quote, she says, "No one is more surprised than me," end of quote. So it is a real honor to be up here talking about such a great organization that I've seen from the outside for so long. Jack Danforth actually gave me my first job in Washington. And while I've had many jobs in business as an entrepreneur and many years as head of Ernst & Young now, I've never left Washington, kind of like an entitlement. But he and Bob Kerry had taught me a lot. They taught me about public service. The partnership showed me the power of listening and the power of compromise, how to build bridges and tackle the toughest issues. Great leaders at a great time. And not coincidentally, they're the same values that define the Concord Coalition. When Paul Tsongas, Warren Rudman, and Pete Peterson founded the organization 25 years ago, they released a statement of the American people outlining their mission. And in it, they pledged to, quote, "tell the truth that are often obscured in our political dialogue, to work with our fellow Americans to shape the hard choices we must face as a nation, and to debate those choices with national interest and future generations in mind." And for 25 years, that's exactly what this organization's done. It's been a crucial voice in our politics and in our public debates. We've never been afraid to say the truth, even when they're unpopular. And today, I think we all would agree that that work and the perspectives are more crucial than ever. Certainly a lot has changed in the last 25 years. Just today, we remember 10 years ago today, the iPhone was created. It's kind of remarkable. It didn't exist when I was a kid. No internet, none of that stuff. But some things haven't changed in 25 years, and some of those are, of course, our debt and our deficits, and these problems are more daunting than ever. When the Kerry Danforth Commission released our report in 1994, I was the chief of staff for that commission. 2 years after the coalition was founded, the deficit was 2.8% of GDP. Today, it's 3.2%. CBO says it's going to 4% by 2029 and 6.5% of GDP a decade later. But I don't necessarily like to focus just on the income statement. Working in a large accounting firm, and you look at the income statement, if you have deficits and you're investing, that's okay as long as your balance sheet is strong. But we know we got a bigger issue when we look at our balance sheet as a country. In 1994, the national debt was $3.5 trillion. Today, it's $14.5 trillion. Gross debt is close to $19 trillion. It's even more striking when you look at it as a percent of GDP. In 1994, it was 48%. Today, it's 77% of GDP. And in less than 30 years, if we stay on this path, the debt is on the track to more than double to 140% of GDP in 2046, well in excess of the historical high after World War II. Now, it's no secret what's driving these problems. As a country, we've put an enormous amount of spending on autopilot. Basically, entitlements and interest on the debt. And every year, these costs are going up and up and up. Last year, nearly 70 cents on every dollar the federal government collected was automatically spent like an automatic teller machine. So the government collects a dollar, 70 cents goes out right away for transfer payments, for entitlements, interest on the debt. 30 cents are left for discretionary spending. Of that 30 cents, about 15 cents are left for defense, which is, some would say, not enough in the current environment. Leaves about 15 cents left in the dollar to spend for everything we think of as growing this country and protecting us. National defense, Head Start, infrastructure, national parks, education. Obviously, an incredibly small and shrinking percentage. And it's only going to get worse. 10,000 people are going to keep retiring every single day for the next 13 years. And that's going to continue to drive the expenditures for these important programs of Social Security and Medicare. So we have to figure something out. Interest rates are bound to go up. We already know they're at pretty much historical lows, and they're starting to raise them. As a result, by 2026, if things don't change, the projections are that mandatory spending and interest on the debt will consume all of our current levels of federal revenues. And obviously, that would leave nothing left for anything for the future. So we've all heard these numbers. I'm not telling anyone in this room anything new, so I won't spend a lot more time on them. I think I hit that by accident. I'm sorry. Jason, you ready? just testing if you're here. Is Jason here? There's Jason. Hi, Jason. Sorry, I'm on a computer here underneath my book. And as we continue to focus on these numbers, I think what's really important is to look what's behind these numbers. It's a generational challenge. As we devote more and more of our budget to interest, entitlements, automatic spending, it'll keep crowding out every other priority that we want to focus on. It will make it harder to invest in any of the areas that are critical for our future. It will hold back economic growth, future competitiveness, and lay us an unsustainable burden on the next generation. The federal government already spends $7 for every senior for each dollar it spends on a child, a ratio that will get worse as we have more and more elderly living longer, consuming more health care at a higher cost. Now, I know we're facing a lot of challenges, but this is one that I think we can't afford to let go. We need to act, and we need to act soon. Of course, if it was easy to solve, we would have done it. Solving our debt is one of the most complex problems in American politics. But to start, I think it's clear we need to focus on just a few different areas. First, and most importantly, we need to deal with the ATM machine, the automatic spending on entitlements and interest on the debt. It consumes, as I said, the vast majority of our spending. Both Jack Danforth and Bob Kerrey have been incredible heroes on this. They highlighted this issue 25 years ago, and it's still out there. It hasn't obviously gotten any better. At the same time, it's not just cutting expenditures. You cannot cut yourself to growth. We need to figure out a way to drive economic growth back to at least historical levels, if not beyond, which will be very difficult. But let's be honest, there's not an easy solution to any of this. So if we're going to ask people to give up some of their long-term benefits, if we're going to ask politicians to go out there and try and sell, we need to slow the growth in these important programs. We also need to make sure they feel confident in their jobs and income currently, unless they're not going to be willing to do so. It means we need to think about things that will grow the economy. I think tax reform is one of them. Skills training is another. Infrastructure is incredibly important, one that we've ignored for too long. But before we can do any of these, we need to do something about the politics and dysfunction that have been holding back Washington. We've been gripped in short-termism. It's not just a Washington issue, it's a corporate issue around the world. Quarterly profits, share buybacks, dividends, no investments in research, long-term skill training. We see the same thing here in Washington. We need to take a hard look at how we handle our budget process and how our leaders can be incentivized to look beyond the next election. This is critical to regaining the public trust. This trust has waned incredibly in recent years because without that trust, our leaders will never have the license to be able to deal with these tough issues. If we want to put our nation back on a sustainable path, we need to create the muscle memory in our system to tackle big challenges once again. So with the remainder of time today, I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these. I'm going to start with entitlements because, as I said, they're at the core of our debt challenge. We simply, absolutely cannot solve the problem without doing something about this issue. Now, let me say at the outset, I know this is politically charged. When I was the chief of staff of the Entitlement Commission, as a staff, we put out a whole list of options that you can look at to slow the growth in entitlements and raise revenue to offset this long-term imbalance. And Shortly after we put it out there were 650,000 postcards that came to our desk and says, Entitlement Commission staff is killing the elderly. That's what they said. And there was only one staffer that was listed in each one of these postcards, Mark Weinberger. And it was a rude awakening as a very young staffer back then as to the political nightmare that I just walked into. It got so bad even my own mother wouldn't return my phone calls. And so this is not for the faint of heart, and there's a reason why it hasn't been touched in all these years. But we know we need to deal with it. Social Security and Medicare are getting closer and closer to insolvency every day. According to the last official estimate, Social Security Trust Fund will no longer be able to pay out full benefits by 2034. So there could be a cut, I think, by up to a third or 20-some% if we don't deal with it. Medicare Trust Fund is set to run out even sooner by 2028. Disability Trust Fund is virtually there. So we need to modernize these to save the programs as well. And I don't have to tell you about that. Talking about entitlement reform is a lot easier than actually doing it. But the good news is there's a lot of work that's already been done. And it's sitting out there in a lot of different shelves with a lot of dust on it, and it just hasn't been picked up lately. If we look at the major issues, I remember back in the Carey Danforth Commission, we do need to raise the eligibility age, in my view, for Social Security and Medicare. I mean, when Social Security was created in the 1930s, if you were an adult, your lifespan was 65 years old, the same age that you were basically eligible for benefits. They had it right. Today, you're going to live to late 70s, 80s, a quarter of your lifespan in collecting benefits. And that's just not what the system was created for. And so we have to figure out a way to deal with that. There's ways you can ameliorate the problem. It's not for existing elderly, and you can have early benefits for some people in difficult industries where they're not going to be able to work longer. There's a lot of things you can do, but you have to recognize you can't have these programs for a quarter of your lifespan and pay for them with less and less dependents who are paying payroll taxes for more and more elderly that are more and more expensive. And so it is a real problem that obviously we all know we have to deal with. I do believe in means testing. I understand what that does. I understand it takes it away from this belief that these are insurance programs pre-funded and ready out there. But none of these insurance programs, AFLAC wouldn't underwrite any of them under the current funding. And so bottom line is they have to be, in my view, looked at. You got to look at this cost of living adjustments, adopting changed CPI. You got Gene Sterling here, who's done more work on this than I'll ever do. So you're going to hear from a great panel as well, and from Mr. Furman, who have looked at these issues for a long time. So I'm just raising the problems. They're going to fix them when I leave here. Yeah, absolutely. And healthcare, I think, healthcare will be finished by July 4th, I think they said, right? So we should have that all finished. Obviously, we need to have a system that's going to provide healthcare to those who can't have it, but we also need to bend the cost curve. It's just impossible to continue to afford it under the current system. That's the more difficult problem, obviously, than the Social Security issues. So these are many of the challenges out there, and they each come with their own pluses and minuses. But what we do know, if we don't fix these problems, the debt gets bigger. We'll have weaker economic growth. We'll have less security. And we'll have future retirees even more at risk than they are today. So let me talk for a moment about economic growth. As I said at the beginning, you can't cut our way to getting out of this problem. It is no surprise we've had trouble getting the American people to focus on Social Security, Medicare, veterans benefits, extremely important programs to the poor and the elderly, when at the same time their situation in front of them is incredibly dire. In a recent Fed survey, 46% of Americans said that if they were hit with an emergency expense of $400, they'd need to borrow the money just to get to the next pay period. Imagine if you were that person living paycheck to paycheck in the middle of this country, not being able to afford any emergency, and the politicians in Washington said, but trust us, we want to reduce your long-term health care and savings. We want to slow the growth of them. Even though they want to reduce them, we want to slow the growth of them. No one is listening when they're scared and when they're worried about having a current job and a current income. So I don't think we're ready. And that's probably why the politicians haven't put it front and center like we all would have liked them to do to deal with this issue until we get through some of these current jobs and growth issues. So we really do need to focus on it. And that's what I'm going to say. I know it won't be very popular, but I think you're going to see probably in the short term deficits that will be aimed at trying to stimulate the economy before we get to fixing our balance sheet. That's because in the immediate term, I think when you look at economic growth and you look at the kind of things that are going to drive it, talk about them in a moment, it's really hard to do on a deficit neutral basis. It is absolutely essential it's done on a fiscally responsible basis, but deficit neutrality will be tough. In addition to tax reform, which I said is, I think, crucial, smart investments in our future, Smart investments in worker training and jobs, infrastructure, all cost money. On tax reform, I think it's important to just think about it, because you look at how the world has changed over the last few decades and why I think this is so important. The 1986 Act was the last time we had major tax reform, and we lowered the tax rates to, I think it was 35 or 36. And we were a tax haven. The United States had one of the lowest corporate tax rates in the world. Today, we have one of the highest. And we have worldwide earnings taxation, of course, and we're the only country in the world that has a tax rate over 30% and taxation of worldwide earnings, even though it's deferred. And that is, yes, it sounds like, okay, well, maybe the companies could be to pay more, and maybe that when you look at the effective tax rates, there's all these arguments about what it is. But the bottom line is, this has real consequences. It is driving U.S. businesses, capital, and jobs overseas. Why did Democrats and Republicans come together for the first time and talk about lowering corporate tax rates? Not exactly a popular thing back in the homeland, and not something Democrats would normally have embraced necessarily, because we've had 20 major companies over the last 5 years pick up and move outside the United States, their headquarters. And I assure you, they're attacked as not being patriots. But no CEO wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I got great news for our company today. I'm really excited to tell you this. We're going to move our headquarters from the United States of America to Ireland or to Switzerland or somewhere else. It's a last-ditch effort to try and stay competitive. And it's not one change, but it's the cumulative effect of years and years and years of additional taxes being put on in different places and the system that we have that has taken us away from the 90% of the OECD countries have reduced corporate tax rates around the world. So bottom line is, we are in a more fierce battle for competition today as the rest of the world is coming out of poverty. 90% of everyone alive under the age of 30 lives in an emerging market. In 1995, 18% of the global Fortune 500 companies were from emerging markets. Today it's 157. It went from 18 companies, to 157 companies. 10 years from now, over half the biggest companies in the world will be in emerging markets. 95% of the world's consumers are outside the United States, 80% of GDP growth. If we don't have a recognition that we are no longer just looking at the US, but competing across the world, we will continue to lose this. So I think tax reform and growth that could come from it, if done the right way, is going to be important. Now, when I say tax reform, I don't mean huge tax cuts. I mean reform. I mean getting rid of some of the deductions, credits, incentives that have outstayed their use that are really hard to get rid of, and offsetting that against the cost of the lower rates in the territorial system. And I think that will all be on the table this year. I'm optimistic because I'm a born optimist, but we are running out. We have less than 80 days left in the legislative calendar. Lots of things on the table, and they really are going to be turning to this in the fall. But I think it's really crucial to get something done that will stimulate the economy. The Business Roundtable, Bob mentioned, I sit on that board. I'm on the executive committee. I run the Tax and Fiscal Policy Committee. Did a survey. 86% said they would invest in capital equipment to raise productivity if they got a more effective corporate tax system. 72% they would hire more people over the next year. 90% said if tax reform doesn't happen, they're going to have to cut back on both. We've had capital expenditure decrease for almost 10 years in a row, partially because of the energy crisis, but it's still gone down quite significantly. That doesn't help our already limited productivity. So we need to, in my view, really focus on that. And once we do that, we got to keep going. We do have to retrain our workforce. It is remarkable how many people we have that were equipped for the 20th century, not the 21st century. We have tripled the manufacturing in this country over the last 20 years, but we do it with a third the number of workers. There's over 16 million jobs available out there right now in the apprenticeship type model in welding and construction and everything else, and these jobs aren't being filled because everyone's getting a 4-year degree under the old system. We have to look at our education system. We have to look at our skills training as well, which is why I'm pleased, actually, President Trump put his executive order out to invest $200 million in apprenticeships and job training. We've got EY as 250,000 people. We hired 62,000 people last year. We operate in 157 countries. I've seen what they do in Germany and how well it works and other countries, and we've got to really look at that here as well. So we need to focus on that. I'm also a big believer in infrastructure, incredibly important. We got a D+ from the American Society of Civil Engineers, which means we haven't improved in the last many, many years. We've had flat for the last several decades investment in our infrastructure. In the last, I think it's 20 years or so, we've built no new airports in the United States. China's built 20. And so it's quite remarkable what we have ahead of us in order to come up with money to do that. So I do think we have to grow the economy to get the license and credibility back to start tackling these very tough issues. And business could help quite a bit as well. The other and last point I'll make on growing the economy, I think it's incredibly important, is we need to do more to keep women in the workforce. We will not be successful if 50% of our population is left out or left behind. And it is incredibly sad, the rates of retention that you see for women across the board. And part of it is 70% of working families are made up of dual family incomes or single parents, and 40% of American families rely on mothers as the sole or primary source of income. They have to choose between raising their kids, which is now more expensive than ever, or having a job. And so we need to find a way, business to be more flexible, government to provide incentives for childcare. There's a no paid family leave is something that was probably, for those who are against entitlements, an anathema. But boy, we need to do something to get people in the workforce so they're not longer on government assistance. And we have to figure this out. It's an incredibly important issue. So all of this is critical, but if we want to strengthen our future, we need to step back and fix a few things that are holding back our politics today. We're living in a world where bipartisanship is a dirty word, where compromise feels impossible. And that's a real problem. It's because we need both parties at the table if we want to solve these issues. Not just their votes, we need both parties' ideas. No single party has the cornerstone and all the best ideas. And simply put, unless both sides are bought in, what we're finding out, they're not sustainable. None of these programs are sustainable when the other party comes in charge. But the problem right now is that the incentives in Washington are to keep our politicians laser focused on the next election. Members of the House have to run every 2 years, putting their mindset on permanent campaign. And with gerrymandering, we have a situation where there's no incentive to reach across the aisle because all these districts are set up where you're either right or further right or further left. And that's where you have to move. And if you compromise, your seat is in danger. So a real political issue that I think needs to be looked at. And so hopefully these things will be on the table in your discussions as well. The media does bear some responsibility because it gets far more viewers and subscribers when it's tuning in for horse race politics than real policy discussions. During the 2016 presidential debates, debt and entitlement spending each got one question in just one debate, while every debate went into Clinton's emails, WikiLeaks, the Access Hollywood tape, and Trump's tax returns. We want to know why the American people are so focused on that? Because we're not asking the tough questions. There was one question around the debt, and it said, why are you ignoring this problem? And that was it. So as a result of all these factors, we're stuck in a system when the majority almost never tries to reach across the table. That's why you have the Republican Congress now seeking to pass health care in a purely unbelievable process, reconciliation, which is trying to straitjacket all of these issues into a 10-year budget deal with all these requirements, incredibly impossible. The Democrats did the same thing when they put the ACA Act out there. Bush did it in 2001 when I worked with him and we did the Bush tax cuts. Incredibly difficult if you're trying to do something one party alone to get policy and through the process that's going to be really make sense from a policy standpoint. But it doesn't have to be this way. I think we've all seen in our careers and times in Washington again and again that compromise between parties is possible. President Ronald Reagan, House Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski, Republican and Democrat, got together and gave us the '86 Tax Act. George H.W. Bush, Speaker Tom Foley passed the 1990 Budget Reconciliation Act. President Clinton worked with the House Republicans to pass the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. It can get done, but it's not easy. And some of the things we've seen lately with gerrymandering and budget process and others, I think, have made it harder. But these leaders have proven that public service can be good, honorable, people working differences together to figure out greater goals. Public service at its best is an honorable mission to make a positive difference, and it can do so again. I would argue there's a lot more agreement on many of these issues, entitlements and taxes, if you're not talking pure politics. We need just to rediscover how to work together. Get to my last point, which is trust. If we can do that, if we can work together, if politicians didn't run every year bashing each other so much, and that's all that people see in the American people, and they think that's why the numbers are so low, then maybe we would have that public trust, and that would give them the license to deal with these issues. So we talk about the Social Security Trust Fund, we talk about the Health Fund, but the deficit in trust in politicians in America is really, I think, what's slowing us down on all these issues. And if we want our leaders to do that and address them, I think we, again, have to start with economic growth. Since 2008, the struggles of the American people after the financial crisis have lowered the confidence in government institutions, business institutions to historical low. The only ones lower than big business right now is Congress. And it's really hard to make big, tough decisions when nobody trusts you to do what's right for them. And so we have to get that feeling back here somehow. I think this is actually one of the biggest reasons we saw, and this isn't just a U.S. issue, by the way. This is what got Macron to election in France, a new party that didn't exist 2 years ago. It's why probably Donald Trump is elected president of the United States. It's why Brexit happened. This is an issue of slow and a less inclusive growth all around the world. So, in conclusion, I know these are all big challenges, and in Washington, nothing changes overnight, but the cause is urgent as ever. It gets more urgent every day. It's up to all of us, I think, to keep talking about this, to keep advocating it. It's why I'm so glad that we have the Concord Coalition. In our 1994 report, we wrote, "America is at a fiscal crossroads. If we act, we can help ensure continued growth and prosperity. But if we fail to act, we threaten the financial future of our children and our nation." It was true then, it's true now. The moment demands action from us and leaders, but it also requires that we stay vigilant. We can't rely on others to do this because we know it probably won't get done. So that's why I'm proud to be on the board of the Concord Coalition. And Bob, all your great work that you're doing. And I thank everyone who's participating today. And I think and hope we're all up to the challenge. Thank you very much.